I ran twice, I won twice, and I did much better the second time than I did the first. And now, in order to make our country successful, safe, and glorious, I will probably have to do it again, but stay tuned.
Democracy is literally on the ballot. This is a defining moment for the nation. And we all must speak with one voice regardless of our party.
Joe Biden warns that the U.S. could be on a path to chaos if Republican candidates refuse to accept midterm election results, as U.S. law enforcement agencies forecast a rise in threats by domestic violent extremists. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. As millions of Americans voted in the midterms on Tuesday to elect all 435 members of the House of Representatives and just over a third of the 100 members of the Senate, President Biden called the election, quote, a defining moment for the United States, warning that democracy was on the ballot.
In our bones, we know democracy is at risk. But we also know this. It's within our power, each and every one of us, to preserve our democracy.
Biden accused Trump and the Make America Great Again, or MAGA Republicans, of representing, quote, an extremism that threatens the very foundations of the republic. Last week, several government agencies, including the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, issued a memo warning that, quote, following the 2022 midterm election, perceptions of election-related fraud and dissatisfaction with electoral outcomes likely will result in heightened threats against a broad range of targets, such as ideological opponents. And this while dozens of Republican candidates running for federal or statewide office have denied or questioned the result of the 2020 presidential election. A Washington Post tally found nearly 300 election deniers ran for major office in 48 out of 50 states. That's around 50% of all Republican midterm candidates. Some have refused to say whether they will accept the result of Tuesday's election if they lose. Another tally shows that among the 597 GOP candidates who ran for office this week, 308 have raised doubts about the 2020 presidential election result. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump is set to renew his bid for the White House.
In order to make our country successful and safe and glorious, I will very, very, very probably do it again, okay? Very, very, very probably.
With Trump announcing his candidacy for 2024, where does it leave the Republican Party and the race for the White House? Joining me now to discuss all this is Jim Nicholson, former chairman of the Republican National Committee. Jim Nicholson, just a few months ago, in fact, just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump was engulfed in all sorts of lawsuits. Today, he seems to be back with a vengeance. He is at the forefront. He's in campaign mode. Is that good news for the Republican Party?
Depends on who you are in the Republican Party. He has a tremendous following in the Republican Party, including at the Republican National Committee.
For the majority of Republicans, is it good news if he does declare his candidacy so early on?
Well, the good news is that he didn't do anything before these elections today. That would have complicated things because he's controversial. There's no question about that. People have very deep sort of emotional feelings about the guy, and gives a lot of people schizophrenia because his policies as president were fantastic. But, some of his personal habits and attributes turned a lot of people off, including a lot of Republicans.
His policies were fantastic as far as you're concerned, but obviously not all Republicans agree with his policies. But having said that, where does it leave other Republicans who might have challenged him for the party's nomination? Will there be Republican primaries? Can anyone challenge, let alone defeat, Donald Trump in 2024?
That's a good question. The person to keep an eye on, I think, is the governor of Florida, DeSantis. very popular, effective governor who also has a tremendous record of accomplishments, as does Trump, by the way. Again, his policies, I mean, you know, record number of employment of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, very low inflation, full employment really overall, becoming energy independent, was closing up the borders, had crime on the run, I mean, attacking really difficult, knotty issues head on and making progress. So he was a very successful president.
Could you see anyone challenging him, though? Could you see anyone, including the Florida governor, challenging him, given the cult-like following that he still has?
I wouldn't call it a cult. There are just a lot of very, you know, committed Republicans and Americans who appreciate all that he accomplished, and his courage and his candor in taking on problems.
How much of his running, though, has to do with Trump's legal strategy, getting ahead of any potential prosecution or even using any prosecution to his political benefit?
There are a lot of conspiracy theories that run around out there. I think he's running for president because he wants to be president and he wants to get back in charge and continue the programs that he put underway when he was president.
But he still believes that he won twice. He says he won twice. Are you concerned at all that if he runs again in 2024 and if he loses but maintains that he won, that the vote was rigged, that it could further undermine American democracy and Americans' trust in the electoral system?
Well, I hope not. That's an unfortunate phenomenon that's going around. And, you know, our democracy really depends on the confidence people have in the integrity of our elections. So that's a very important matter. I think we are tightening up the conduct management of our elections as a result of this controversy. So maybe we can obviate that as an issue, whether he would win or lose.
But how concerning is it for you, though, as a former chairman of the Republican National Committee, that half of all Republican candidates in the midterms still question the results of the last election?
It's America. People have a right to question. He's not the only one. The woman who ran for governor of Georgia, who's running again today, questioned the fact that she was beaten 4 years ago. She's never.
Well, that's very different. You're talking about Stacey Abrams. She had issues with the way the vote was conducted. But here you have 3/4 of Republicans, 76%, who say they believe there was widespread fraud in 2020 when there is no such evidence.
I agree with that. There's been a paucity of evidence showing that there was voter fraud, and to allege that, you got to have the facts to prove it. And so far, they have not come up with that.
And you have countless judges and courtrooms that have actually thrown out any lawsuits by Trump and his allies that there was widespread fraud. But just a few months ago, though, the Republican leadership seemed to be distancing itself from Trump. Now he's back on the scene. Some Republican donors and governors have decided that it may be time to move on to the next generation. Is it wishful thinking, though, when Trump is almost worshipped by a solid Republican base?
It's wishful thinking for a lot of people that he not run, and wishful thinking that he does run. You know, this is a democracy. This is a free country, free system, and he has a right to run. And they have a right to support him, and he's given them a lot of legitimate reasons to support him as well by his performance as president.
If he runs, do you believe he wins? And if, as many people have predicted, these midterms produce what is being called a red wave. Here in the US, a red wave means a Republican wave. Will Trump ride that wave? Is there anything that could stop him?
He'll be encouraged if there's a red wave today, because he's gotten into a lot of these races, supported a lot of these candidates, and that will be, somewhat of a bellwether of his present effectiveness. And I think that will encourage him, because he will have been behind a lot of candidates who will win. So we'll just have to see. I think there'll be other people looking at running. It certainly looks like Governor of Florida, DeSantis, will probably enter the race, but we don't know yet. You know, we're dealing with a midterm election today, and that's where everybody's focus is.
And a lot of people are focusing on the potential for political violence and politically motivated violence. Just how concerned are you about that in the 90-day period after the election, which is what US intelligence agencies, including the FBI, have predicted?
Any violence concerns me in our country. There's too much of it, especially in our cities. There's too much crime. And if criminals are not treated like criminals. When I was chairman of the Republican National Committee, and then we got President Bush elected, crime went way down. And people would ask, why has crime gone down? And the answer was because we have put the criminals in prison. The criminals are in jail.
But we're not talking about crime in the traditional sense. We're talking about politically motivated violence.
There shouldn't be any of that. There's no place for that from either side. It should not taint our elections in any way.
Jim Nicholson, former RNC chair, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump remains under subpoena by a congressional committee for testimony starting on November 14th. The House committee investigating the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol issued a statement last week giving Trump more time to turn over documents and communications sent or received between Election Day 2020 and Biden's inauguration in January 2021. A letter from the committee accompanying the subpoena stated that Trump personally orchestrated and oversaw efforts to overturn the 2020 election. As Congress continues to grapple with the aftermath of the failed attempt to overturn Biden's victory, the U.S. election system has come under renewed strain this week, with a growing number of Americans saying that the most important issue facing the country are threats to democracy. According to a recent poll, 23% of Americans, mostly Democratic voters, rank this as their key priority ahead of jobs and the economy. Former President Barack Obama, who campaigned with Joe Biden over the weekend, criticized Republicans for, quote, doing everything they can to make it harder for Americans to vote.
The only way to make our democracy stronger is if we fight for it. You can't take it for granted. And that starts with electing people who know you.
Joining me now to discuss the state of American democracy and the growing threats of political violence is former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Steve Grossman. Steve Grossman, did Democrats and President Biden adopt the right strategy by warning that democracy is under assault and by denouncing Trump MAGA Republicans as threats to democracy?
Well, it's hard to know whether that was the right strategy, but it in fact is true. I mean, if you look at the facts currently, you'll find that there's been a rising threat against election administrators. A lot of people are leaving the business of election supervision. There's been a brain drain. We've had at least a couple of dozen candidates for Senate, Secretary of State, and governors claiming that they won't necessarily accept the results of the election. The threats of political violence, particularly in battleground states, has been documented. So if you're concerned about democracy and concerned about the capacity of a system to support the will of the people, and you're doing everything you can to undermine the will of the people or to stand in the way of the will of the people, I think it's right to question that and to make that into a principal issue of deep concern for the people of the United States. I mean, there are other issues that people face, clearly.
Sure, but I mean, questioning it may be valid, but isn't the language that is being used reminiscent of the 2016 presidential campaign when then candidate Hillary Clinton called half of Trump supporters deplorables? I mean, it did cost her a great deal politically, and it opened up the Democratic Party to these renewed criticisms by Republicans that it is an elitist party, that it is out of touch with ordinary, struggling Americans. Does it help to use this type of language? Doesn't it further divide Americans?
Well, listen, we're going to see how much of an impact this has. Clearly, a rising number of Americans are deeply concerned about the state of democracy. I think it's probably fair to say that the vast majority of people are more concerned about their car payments, their mortgage payments, their economic security, inflation, the cost of gasoline, supply chain shortages, and all the rest of the issues that are critical to the American people. But when the Justice Department is sending federal monitors to 24 states to a greater extent than even in the presidential election 2 years ago, there's deep concern that these elections will be seen as being unfair by one party or the other. And if large numbers of people simply don't accept the results, I would call this a perfect storm in many ways, and undermining democracy that we've been so careful about protecting for so many years is, I think, an appropriate warning. And I think President Biden was right to do it, because I think the facts bear it out.
Is it, though, politically wise and appropriate to use this type of language, these types of slogans? Because what they do suggest is that if Republicans win, then democracy is lost.
Listen, you have to take the results of the elections in fair and open elections. But if people fear that the ballot box itself is not necessarily available to them, I mean, this is not simply rhetoric. These are facts. And when former President Trump just last week claimed that the results in Pennsylvania may very well be rigged, I mean, what are Pennsylvanians and the rest of the country to think when you've got an election for governor and for the senator, and it could be a deciding seat? We know that to be the case. And a former president says it very well could be rigged, calling into question the validity of the election itself. And that's happening in many states. I think you have to speak up and say, no, there is no evidence from the last election that elections were stolen or rigged. But when you've got hundreds of candidates running, particularly in the Republican Party, as election deniers, they deny the actual veracity of the last election. That's what I think the president means by democracy itself is on the ballot. And when you add political violence to that, and the incidences of political violence in different parts of the country, it's of deep concern and should be of deep concern to all Americans.
You say it is a deep concern, and it is indeed, because a new poll in the Washington Post shows that 9 in 10 Americans say they are somewhat or very concerned about politically motivated violence. And we know that law enforcement agencies today are on high alert. But when both your party and the Republican Party vilify each other in this way, aren't you both sowing discord? And isn't that how civil strife and civil war starts?
Well, when you have threats of violence and people willing to take matters into their own hands, armed citizens in some cases, those are the kinds of warnings that we should pay great attention to.
What do you say to those who may think that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are both being reckless, are both being myopic, looking at the next tree, essentially, and overlooking the forest?
Look, everyday Americans worry about a lot of things. They worry about the economy, they worry about their families, they worry about financial security, they worry about their jobs, they worry about inflation, car payments, mortgage payments. That's what most people worry about: the price of food, the price of eggs, the price of gasoline. And when inflation is running hot, as we say, that is a deep concern to people because it's a pocketbook issue. And it was James Carville back in Bill Clinton's #1 advisor back in the original election when Bill Clinton was elected in 1992 said, it's the economy, stupid. So we know that's the case. And all the warnings about democracy, notwithstanding, elections often hinge on economic issues. In fact, most often hinge on economic issues. But I don't see election deniers in the Democratic Party. I don't see Democrats suggesting that if they lose, the election may be rigged. I don't see Democratic candidates doing that. I don't think there's no you're suggesting potentially a moral equivalence here. I don't think that's the case. I think you've got candidates in the Republican Party who are so in the thrall of Donald Trump that they have no choice but to go with that mantra. And when he says in Pennsylvania and other places, the election may be rigged, meaning that if my candidate or our candidate loses, then the election was rigged and was illegitimate. If you call into question the legitimacy of free and open democratic elections, you're calling into question the fundamental principle on which this republic was based. I don't think Democrats do that. We will accept the results of the election. And if we lose elections, we've got to bear the consequences and understand that the American people voted their pocketbook or whatever set of issues they voted.
Sure, but it doesn't help when the president, when his approval ratings are so low. Today they've slipped to below 40%. Will Biden run in 2024? And if he does, where does it leave the Democrats' prospects of keeping the White House?
Well, Joe Biden runs in 2024. I will support Joe Biden because I think his record of accomplishment objectively has been a very strong one. But I certainly acknowledge that if the economy, inflation, and economic insecurity is the number one issue, and Democrats have been in charge, they get the blame. The president gets the blame when things go badly, even if the things go badly because of war in Ukraine, price of oil, economic insecurity, Federal Reserve Bank policy, and a variety of other issues that cause inflation to be running at 8% across the country, and in some cases, double-digit inflation. When the price of eggs has gone up by 42% over the past year, and a lot of people buy a lot of eggs, that's something Democrats have to deal with at the ballot box. But I will come back to this notion that there's something bigger at work here than necessarily winning elections. It's preserving this democracy, and in doing so and undermining the quality and caliber of our elections, it causes Americans to doubt their democracy, to doubt their leadership, and that creates the foundation for extremism of many kinds, and it creates the environment in which we could see more political violence, and that's the kind of thing that creates tremendous insecurity, physical insecurity to the American people. That, to me, is a bigger issue. It may not be the issue in which an election turns, but it's the bigger dominant issue for the future of this country. Inflation will come down. No doubt, inflation will come down over time. It may take a recession to do that. You can blame the Federal Reserve Bank. You can blame anybody you want. But in this case, the president and the Democratic Party are getting that blame. But they're putting the issue right square in front of the American people. And they're putting it on Republicans and Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans who are election deniers and who are doing everything they can to undermine the legitimacy of free and fair elections in the United States and creating the potential for political violence in the process. That, to me, is un-American.
All right, former DNC Chairman Steve Grossman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ghida.
In essence, midterm elections are about determining which political party will chart the country's policies until the next electoral cycle. But Tuesday's elections were more than that. Regardless of which party is now in control of the House and the Senate, the historic voter turnout has done little to heal the deeply torn political fabric of the United States. When so many Republican candidates running for electoral office boast, like their spiritual guide, former President Trump, that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, it's hard not to conclude that American democracy isn't already on the rocks and not merely on the ballot, as President Biden and other Democrats have said during the campaign. Urging Americans to vote because democracy itself is at stake is a double-edged sword. This slogan might have resonated with Democrats and independent voters, but it cuts both ways. Trump's so-called MAGA Republicans see it that way too. Their democracy is being usurped, their Christian identity is being subverted, their country is being invaded by hordes of brown illegal immigrants and taken over by their ultra-liberal, even socialist fellow Americans. And so in short, whether Democrats or Republicans control one or both chambers of the US Congress will do little to ease tensions in Washington and across the country. The level of political vitriol and acrimony and the string of lawsuits hanging over the presumptive standard-bearer of the Republican Party, will only exacerbate the already profound societal rifts. And it is chipping away at a US Constitution transfixed in time, one that established the Union itself but no longer seems able to protect it. As Obama said just a few days ago, when democracy withers, it's hard to restore. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.